here for this. And it's not like it's not like RBMS where the first session is at 8. The keynote and everyone is at 8.
Do people get there?
Some.
Oh, okay. Is there opening remarks or we're just doing it? Yeah. How do I turn my mic on or they do it? They'll do it. Okay.
Go. I should leave my phone down. I'm going to time myself, though.
They should have a clock at the back of the room.
You can use my timer if you want.
I need to not talk fast. When I get like excited, I speed up. So my goal is to
breathe.
Do you think we need like that mic?
No, we should
be okay.
Yeah,
Yesterday
It depends. Sometimes you could hear people and sometimes you couldn't.
Is it a wireless one? Yeah. Maybe we should.
Sometimes I had trouble hearing people.
I know. I was going to invite everyone.
They got better at adjusting it. Yeah.
looks like it's on.
Oh, man, right there.
I hear it.
You too? Okay.
Good morning, everybody. Can everyone in the back hear me? Yes, awesome. Well, welcome. Thanks for coming back this dreary Saturday morning. We are very excited to be here. I love this group of folks that I get to share a stage with. And we might disrupt this format a little bit. We're thinking we're going to stay seated together throughout this panel just to sort of highlight our collectivism and solidarity as we talk about have some courageous conversations. So our panel today will be kind of addressing this question about how we can confront and rectify exclusionary practices in our institutions. We all have experience doing this every day. So I'm just going to introduce my very wildly intelligent colleagues. Oh, yes. I'm Amanda Jasso, sorry. And we'll start with Rachel Winston. She is the inaugural Black Diaspora Archivist at the University of Texas at Austin. In her work, Rachel is helping to build a library special collection documenting the Black experience across the Americas and Caribbean. Her professional interests include exploring the documentation and representation of the Black diaspora within cultural institutions, digital humanities, and using archives for activism. Yay, Rachel. Let me find Curtis. Yes. And next to her is Curtis Small. He is coordinator of public services for special collections at the University of Delaware, where he coordinates the reference, instruction, and exhibition programs. He is also a project member of the Colored Conventions Project, a digital humanities project that documents the largest African-American political movement of the 19th century. Curtis's research interests include the history of the African-American book, the history of the Colored Conventions movement, and Caribbean Francophone literature. He currently serves as co-chair of the Rare Book and Manuscript section of the Association of College and Research Libraries. In this capacity, he has helped develop activities and projects aimed at increasing the diversity among professionals in the areas of special collections and archives. He holds a PhD in French from New York University and an MLIS from Simmons College Graduate School of Library and Information Science.
Can I make one?
Yes.
I want to make one small but significant correction. I am not the co-chair of RBMS. I am the co-chair of the Diversity Committee of RBMS. We have a wonderful section head, Shannon Supple, who's at Smith College.
I know.
Good feedback.
Yes, thank you. We were talking about that. No, thanks. And then we have Debra Yepa-Pappan, who is Korean and a tribally enrolled member of the Pueblo of Jemez. She is currently the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Native American Exhibition Hall renovation project at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. She welcomes Native American visitors to the museum and engages them in dialogue about the exhibits in the hall and about the upcoming renovation. Most importantly, she helps to coordinate visits for Native people to connect with their cultural resources in the museum's collections. As an active member of the Chicago Native American community, she also serves as a liaison between the museum and the community. She is an artist with international acclaim in the field of contemporary Native American art. And through her artwork and her work at the Field Museum, she is committed to changing inaccurate representations of Native people and advocates for the inclusion of Native first voice and perspectives. If you haven't seen her work, you should really check it out online.
Thank you. So I just, want to acknowledge, as a Native person, I recognize that we are all actually guests on this land, and we are on Native land here. So I do want to acknowledge that Texas was the home to the Caddo people, Apache people, Comanche, Wichita, Tonkawa. Tonkawa people especially lived here in the area of Austin. Today, Austin has a population of about 8,000 Native people. So that's something that's very important to recognize. And we had the honor of meeting a few of those community members last night. Shannon and I went to an event last night that's here on campus. There's an American Indian and or Native American and Indigenous Studies program here at UT, and they have a pretty active student group. So we were fortunate enough to spend some time with them last night, and a few of them are here today. So we're very happy that they're here to join us. I want to thank you and give my respects and gratitude to all Native people here, and on behalf of my panel members here.
So I'm Curtis, and I'm up first, and I'm going to see if the slides are going to come on. So today I'm going to talk about the Colored Conventions Project. I have to leave a lot out in the interest of time, but this is going to be a rapid overview of, first, an introduction to the historical movement, the Colored Conventions movement of the 19th century, and an introduction to this digital humanities project, the Colored Conventions Project, that makes the documents and primary sources of the 19th century movement available. In the presentation, I will also describe some of the principles that have guided the work that we've done as a project, in line with our goal of curating and using data in a way that works against the exclusion of individuals and groups who have experienced oppression and erasure in history. So what you see here in this page is the landing page of our digital humanities site, coloredconventions.org. So first, to talk about the Colored Conventions movement of the 19th century, as the introduction or biography said by my kind colleague, this is the largest Black-led civil rights movement of the 19th century. It spanned most of the 19th century, and the Colored Conventions movement provided the template for the first permanent national civil rights organizations at the end of the 19th century, such as the National Equal Rights League, and leading up to the formation of the NAACP, with which most people are familiar. Prominent African American leaders were involved in the colored convention movement, most notably Frederick Douglass, but there were also many individuals whose names are unknown to us. Conventions arose in response to the often difficult situation facing African Americans through the 19th century. The first convention, which happened in Philadelphia, arose in response to the persecution of formerly enslaved individuals who were moving into the state of Ohio and were seen as a threat by white laborers. This is a movement that was fundamentally American in its approach and outlook and procedures. There were delegates at conventions, debates, and resolutions were adopted by means of voting on the part of the convention delegates. Public statements came out of conventions that served to influence both black and white public opinion. Some conventions generated petitions to the government during the period of the rolling back of voting rights, for example, for black men at the beginning of the 19th century. Plans for actions were taken at conventions, such as the setting up for schools and many other projects. There was strategizing and thinking that went on about where black Americans should focus their efforts politically and professionally. And the conventions, in some instances, collected data about black professionals as a way of showing the ways in which black Americans were contributing to American society. Now I'll talk a little bit about the Colored Conventions Project, which is based at the University of Delaware, where I work, and it's about a 7-year-old project. First, I'll say, by way of background, and this should be interesting to the librarians and archivists here, there was no central organization that anchored the Colored Conventions movement. These conventions were independent, connected, there were networks, but they were autonomous and independent events. And as a result of this, the proceedings and the minutes of the various conventions ended up being dispersed in various libraries, archives, historical societies, and newspapers at the end of the 19th century as the movement was winding down. So this situation of dispersal was an obstacle to deep research on the movement, and there was a print history of the colored conventions that's been partly written, but remains to be developed. So what the Colored Conventions Project has done is to bring together the largest collection of documents from convention proceedings that have ever been assembled in one site. And this is a virtual site. These are transcriptions and digitized versions of the convention proceedings. Before the development of the Colored Conventions Project, there were 3 published volumes of convention minutes. Historians knew about the movement, but not many other people. So what the project has done is multiplied the number of available sets of proceedings that are available to researchers and students. And as a result, research on this movement is being revolutionized. There's been 1 symposium, and there's a volume of scholarship that's going to be coming out soon. The site itself features as primary sources the convention proceedings and other documents that were related, sometimes newspaper articles or calls that went out before, petitions, and also includes exhibits, research in the form of exhibits that provide context for the materials and help viewers understand the ways in which this movement was a vital part of the thinking, debate, and activism that was happening among African Americans in the 19th century around issues such as anti-slavery before the Civil War, immigration, citizenship, education, and other areas. Here on this page you see a title page of one of the first convention that took place in Philadelphia at Mother Bethel AME Church. That was the building you saw in the first slide. This was where the first convention took place. And also the landing page of the project that you'd seen before. So I should also say that the relatively recent research in the symposium has helped extend our understanding of the lifespan of this organization, because it was thought that the movement had ended with the Civil War. There was one book about the Color Conventions Project that was produced in the 50s by Howard Holman Bell, and he actually thought, based on the minutes that he had access to, that it had ended with the Civil War. But since this project has come into being, we've learned that it extended after the Civil War, particularly in the South where color conventions took place, including ones that we discovered in the state of Texas that we knew nothing about. So we actually don't know exactly how many colored conventions there were. We're still discovering them. So in the interest of time, I want to move on to talk about our principles. I hope I've given a sense of the importance of this movement, some sense, which is still relatively unknown. Now, the project, from its inception, has adopted principles that help ensure the ways in which we operate do not work to exclude groups or individuals who were involved in the work of the movement then, and we want to work against the exclusion of individuals who work on the project now. I'm not going to be able to read all the principles, but I will highlight some examples of practices of the Color Conventions Project and the principles that inspire them. The first principle, and you'll see the principles on the next page, the first of our principles says, quote, CCP, the Color Convention Project, seeks to enact collective organizing principles and values that were modeled by the Color Conventions movement. So I'll say in a general way that the bravery and commitment that the movement represents on the part of the participants in the 19th century is an example to us who work with the project. Debate, discussion, and consensus are a part of our strategizing process as we develop this project. And the other principles flow from this basic principle that we are inspired by the spirit and by the community that was represented by the Color Conventions Project. Principle number 2 states that the project affirms black women's centrality to 19th century black organizing, even as official records erase and anonymize the very contributions, labor, and infrastructure that made the Color Conventions movement possible. So this principle came out from the inception of the project. One of a graduate student suggested, a woman, why don't we include women in the research of this project? In most cases, delegates to conventions were men. However, many women attended conventions, and there was a certain number of delegates who were women, and made contributions to support the movement in ways that are often not referenced in the proceedings. So the Color Conventions Project seeks to counteract this feature by means of supporting and encouraging research that underlines the contributions of women to the Color Conventions movement. And this is a methodological issue. The historian Psyche Forson Williams at the University of Maryland has done material culture studies research that uses evidence from newspaper advertisements for the boarding houses where convention delegates stayed in various locations where conventions took place in the various cities, such as Philadelphia. These spaces were often run by women, and Psyche Forson Williams speculates that in these spaces, women often exercised influence, political influence and other influence in ways by means, for example, of participation in political discussions that took place in the boarding houses where delegates slept and dined, although you won't find explicit references to this in the minutes. You may find a fleeting reference. The image that you see at the center on this page shows a card that expresses thanks to a woman who had a boarding house in Philadelphia where convention attendees stayed during the Philadelphia Convention of 1835. Now, this woman, Serena Gardner, is not mentioned in the minutes, but this is a type of artifact that you need to consciously seek out in order to flesh out the contributions of women in the convention movements. And this is a model for other types of research that people can do to render people visible. The infographic on the left shows locations of conventions where women served as delegates or where women are mentioned in the proceedings in some capacity, maybe a brief reference to a speaker or a visitor. This infographic is part of an exhibit that is on our site that was created by a wonderful graduate student, which focuses on the role of the color conventions movement, and was also inspired by Psyche Forson Williams's methodologies. The third image is the image of a photograph of Marianne Shadd Cary, who was a prominent 19th century activist. She was a newspaper editor, the first Black American newspaper editor who emigrated to Canada and ran a newspaper that encouraged emigration to Canada among African Americans. So next, I'll talk in general, and here you see the principles. It's too small for you to read. If you go to colorconventions.org, you can see all the principles. I'll check my time. I'm going to wrap up, but I will say that another one of our principles, the last principle, talks about the importance of not erasing data subjects, Black subjects of data more generally. And when I say a Black subject of data, I mean an individual as represented through the lens of a data source, a data source. The most extreme example of this would be, for example, an enslaved individual who's referred to in a ledger as slave, male slave, 11 years old, with no further information. Now, you're not going to find this type of reference in the Color Conventions Project. However, there are other instances with women, for example, that I mentioned, where people are not made anonymous and made known, made and named, and we encourage researchers to name individuals when possible in their research and in their teaching. So this area is more highly developed in terms of our teaching partnerships, but they're asked to sign a memorandum of understanding by which research that's done on men in the convention movement will be accompanied by research for a corresponding woman who may be associated but may not be mentioned. And as a result of this, there's a lot of information about women and research on our website. And we also ask researchers to do this, for other individuals, men, groups, and communities if they use our data sets. So I'm going to end there. There's a lot more to be said, and maybe during our conversation I'll talk about some of the other principles in terms of how people are paid, for example, and acknowledged and cited in the work. But I'll end there, and I hope I've given you some sense of how important this project is and how important the movement was. And the core of it is really the community then and now that sustains us and inspires and teaches us about the contributions of those that went before us. Thank you.
Thank you, Curtis. I always enjoy hearing about the work of Color Conventions Project, so it's great to get an update on that end. I would like to start first by saying I'm so excited to share this stage with colleagues that I respect so deeply and to be in community with colleagues and friends whose professional work and insights I admire and that have come to impact my own. And so thank you for being here. My name is, my name is Rachel. Yes, there we go. My name is Rachel. I am the Black Diaspora Archivist here on campus at UT Austin, and I lead a project that we call the Black Diaspora Archive. This campus-wide collaborative project launched in 2015 with my hire and brings together, as I just mentioned, multiple institutions on campus with the intention of building a special collection here that better documents and highlights the experiences and lives of people of color, Black people, Afro-descended people in the global South, across the Americas, and in the Caribbean. So, I heard there was a delay. Well, I can continue. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Uh-oh. Oh, no, I got too overzealous. All right. So I office out of Lilas Benson. The collection itself physically lives at Lilas Benson, but this project could not happen without the other members of this partnership, including the university libraries and the Department of Black Studies. These units came together many years ago after having collaborated in past projects with this vision of building something sustainable, intentional, that builds upon the Benson's existing collecting areas. We're on the eve of our centennial. So the Benson has been collecting for a long time in this area, but not in such a dedicated way. And with a commitment, a financial commitment of recurring funding from the Office of the President, we're really able to make this happen in practice. In my role, I do a lot of advocating. I advocate for the archives, I advocate for students, I advocate for our collections, and this financial piece, because it's there, is one less thing I have to advocate for and allows me to have more time with the collections and working to enrich what we have here on campus. And so that really has helped to make this successful and me more successful in moving this project forward. I also, one more note about the partnership. I think this kind of decentralized nature, or decentralizing the nature of collection development is significant, specifically when we're talking about Black communities, and not having such an imperial or colonial stance in collecting. I think that it strengthens our overall impact. And in a way, to pull in a little bit of critical race theory, there's some interest convergence here, right? So each institution that participates in this project has incredible strengths and resources they're able to bring to this table. And collectively, we're able to do something that no institution on its own could do. So I think that this collective part, while sometimes it's tricky and we're still figuring out how it works, I think it's foundational to the success of what I'm trying to do with this archive. So at this point, you're probably thinking, that sounds really great, Rachel. What do you do on a day-to-day basis? How do you collect? So I work with my colleagues to build upon the Benson's existing strong collection, and in this case, most often in colonial documents, documents from folks coming to colonial territories and documenting what they see via annual reports, travel logs, photographs, and that kind of thing. So I work with my colleagues to bring in additional resources like that. With the financial support at my disposal, I'm also able to partner with my colleagues and our rare book partners, our rare book vendors that we work with, to diversify the rare book collections that come in. So this is an example of a book we brought in, a graphic novel we brought in from a graphic novelist in Jamaica. It's a 4-part series. We have 3 of them. So again, just thinking more critically and strategically about what we can do to expand our collecting practices and make them a little more representative. And building upon this collaboration and the partners involved in it, this image to the left is an art print titled Memory Jacket by an artist, Janet Taylor Pickett. And this print came in with a joint collection that the Benson purchased with the Department of Black Studies. So again, collaborative ownership, jointly owned collections. And as a shameless plug, I had the opportunity to curate an exhibition from this collection of prints entitled Brandywine Art Prints, from which this specific print comes from. And this exhibition is a multi-site show. One installation is in the Gordon White Building where Black Studies is housed, and the other is in the Benson collection. So using this partnership to do things and create spaces that might not have happened before this Black Diaspora Archive project existed. And lastly, in addition to doing current things differently, there's also an opportunity to do some different things. So this is a poster from a collection that I have in the Black Diaspora, or that the Black Diaspora Archive stewards. The Links Incorporated is a Black women's civic organization. There are several chapters here locally in Texas, one of them in Austin I have worked with since before any gift agreement was ever signed, just speaking with them about archives, what an institutional repository could do and how it could benefit them and how we could work together. So I've been working with this group. It's an open, ongoing collection. About once a year I get additions, but really working with community organizations in a way that I hadn't seen the Benson do before. For those of you who were here yesterday and heard my colleague Teresa Polk speak so wonderfully about the post-custodial initiatives that the Benson undergoes, the Black Diaspora Archive has been integrated into those initiatives, and that has been so wonderful. I think that it helps to strengthen our overall collections, and it's also been a two-way benefit, right? So our collection is stronger, and on the ground in Brazil, when I had the opportunity to meet with community members whose family stories and legacies and livelihoods are represented in the collection of the organization we're partnering with, to have them look at me with excitement and some surprise, quite honestly, to know that someone like me was helping to steward this collection and work with their materials, and the sense of comfort that they brought them, I think, was an unintended benefit, but something very significant and impactful. So continuing to integrate this project into the different operations within the institution is important. While this project is collaborative, there still is always an opportunity for things to get siloed, especially when they're focused on a specific topic. And being intentional about not letting that happen has been key to the success so far. And thinking a little bit beyond just the institutional partners that make this thing happen, I have been working with a faculty member in the Department of History, Dr. Dinah Ramey Berry, for the past several years on this project, the Texas Domestic Slave Trade Project, which looks to document the routes and routes and movement of enslaved individuals during the domestic slave trade. And so in this capacity, I'm able to really advocate and center primary sources, the Benson's collections, the library's resources, and play a part in training students on doing primary source research, and make that a foundation of what this project is about. So not only engaging our partners, but thinking beyond that to our campus community has been an exciting part of this job as well. And I want to revisit now the image that was on my title slide and make a case for expanding the way we describe and think about what constitutes a Black collection. So this photo comes from a photo collection we have at the Benson, the I.L. Maduro photo collection. It documents the building of the Panama Canal. And the description of this collection is pretty basic, minimal, and mostly geographic in nature, highlighting the places in which most of these photos were taken and not so much the people. And I love to use this collection and this photo when I do classroom instruction. And I'll start by asking students to tell me what they see. And so, they'll mention, oh, there are two men, maybe they're brothers, they seem to know each other, they're standing closely, the road looks muddy, there are shacks, you can see like mountains in the background. So we do this exercise of reading the photograph. And then I'm able to redirect their attention to the right to the Black woman sitting on the porch, and there's a child kind of in the shadows immediately to her right. And I'm able to center her in this photo in a way that is usually illuminating, right? So I ask students to explain or to talk about what they see. What do they think she's doing? How is she experiencing this scene? What does she do? What do you think she was doing right before this photo was taken? What do you think she's going to do after? While the focus of this collection, and certainly even through the lens that the photograph was taken, doesn't focus on people of color, the Black people who helped to construct the Panama Canal, they're documented here. And that gives us a glimpse into their lives, kind of building off what you were saying, Curtis, even though we don't know who they are and what they did experience on a day-to-day basis, we do have a glimpse. And so refashioning the way we look at collections, ones like this, to recenter, I think is a powerful tool. And I want to close with kind of some thoughts about care. You touched on it a little bit, Curtis, and I'm sure we'll get into it later. But as archivists and archival practitioners, care is so central to the work that we do, right? We care for our collections, so we digitize and process and arrange and describe and do all of these things to preserve for infinity, so people can access things from now until forever. So I'm motivated by this sense of care specifically, and in the types of materials I work with, they're challenging, right? Most of the documents I work with talk about document violence, discrimination, oppression. They're dehumanizing in a lot of ways. But I care for them because I care for the people being documented. And as an example, I was doing a class instruction working with students on finding enslaved people in the archive when it is often very hard to. And at the end of the course, a student raises his hand. He says to me, how do you do this? Like, this is really hard, and then you have so much enthusiasm. Like, how does that work? And I think in that moment, my care was read as enthusiasm. But I do care. And I think that it's important as professionals to also implement an ethic of care. So for those of us dealing with documents that are challenging, are sensitive, and still are very important, we should be collecting these things if we're telling a representative story. We have to take care of ourselves also in doing that work. And so for that, I'm really grateful for the professional development support that I get from my institution, because that allows me to tap into a network of colleagues like the ones I'm with today who are able to help me professionally grow, but also manage what it's like to do this work. And that's compounded with the emotional labor that goes into being one of very few Black workers in our library system. And even in the specific building where we work, I'm the only Black person on staff. So it's a lot there, and having networks helps me to be successful and further the success of this project. So out of care for my time, I will close there, but look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Wow, yeah. Just to kind of go off of that, it's caring for the people. And I think that's a good way for me to start. Well, first I want to say thank you so much to Danielle, especially for reaching out to me and convincing me, because when she reached out to me, I was like, I don't know if I'm right for this. And we talked, and she convinced me, and I felt like, yes, the work that I'm doing is right, and I need to share what I'm doing. So thank you, Danielle, and thank you, Stephen, very much for having us here. This is exciting. And so I do want to I want to make a confession. I feel like I'm a little bit of an outsider here because I'm not a museum or trained museum professional. I'm an artist. I'm a mother and a wife of an artist and daughter. I'm a community person in my community in Chicago. And so a lot of the work that I've done in the last 10 years has been all about Native people and for Native people. So that's the experience that I bring with me to the museum as the community engagement coordinator at the Field Museum. And it's my care about and my love for my Native people that I'm here. Are you all familiar with the Field Museum? You want to talk about the epitome of colonial institution? Here we go. But what we're doing now is we're changing the narrative there. And the work that I'm doing is trying to indigenize the Field Museum. I preferably don't like to use the word decolonize or decolonization of the Field Museum because I think the only way to really do that is to burn it down, and I know that's not going to happen. And not without having to give everything back first. But definitely we can do. There's a lot that we can do to indigenize the Field Museum. So the Field Museum is 125 years old. It's been in its current location since about 1921. That's when it first opened to the public, the building that we're in right now. It's a beautiful building, granted, but it's a very just ginormous structure, with columns, and it's very just colonial. So I wanted to start with this image because something that Shannon said yesterday too in her presentation, and what this strikes to me is, this photo gives me the chills. This is when they were moving the collection into the current location. The Field Museum was founded from the 1893 World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, where they brought Native people and people of other cultures to Chicago and created these sort of people zoos. Villages were recreated. People actually brought, stuff from their home territories to Chicago to create these villages. They brought their clothing, their traditional clothing, their, just all of their things. And then those things were, purchased by, the collectors at the Field Museum, and they created the Field Museum from those things. But the reason that this image gives me the creeps is that, the Field Museum has a lot of, dead animals, dinosaur bones, things that are long gone, things that are, no longer. So this image reminds me of, these men to me look like hunters, and what's in the case looks like they're trophies, and they look like they're the skins of Native people. So to me it's a very haunting image, and that's how the Field Museum was founded. Here's an example of a few of the cases that are in our Native American Hall. I believe these photos, maybe one is from the 40s, maybe one is from the 60s with the Women's Board. So the Native American Hall that we're talking about right now last opened in 1949, and it hasn't changed since then, so that's 70 years. So the reason I wanted to show these cases is because these cases still look the same. They're still as is. Though I'm sure the dresses at the time were a lot cleaner, and the bison is a huge hit with, the public and a lot of Native people that come through too, but those cases have not changed. This is a more recent photo of those cases, and this is exactly how the hall looks now. And of course, with terms like ceremonial costumes to refer to our medicine regalia or traditional regalia. And this is how the hall looked for some time. So the Native American Hall opened in 1949. It was renovated. It was brand new at that time. And it had since, just made some changes in that some of these cases had been moved to different locations on the west wing of the museum. And in the past, maybe couple decades, the North American Hall has been here in what we call Hall 8. And it has looked like this, or it had looked like this for quite some time, up until about 2016. When my husband, Chris Pappan, who's a ledger artist, was approached, and our curator, Alika Wali, she really did help to change us into, or move the museum into this direction of changing this hall. She started several years prior to Chris's exhibition with an exhibition with Bunky Echohawk, who's a Pawnee contemporary artist. And there was a small gallery that's at the end of this hall where his work was in, but it was something that was really new for the museum, to have living contemporary artists in the Field Museum, and the artist co-curated their own exhibition. And so Chris had the opportunity to engage with the hall itself, and he created this interaction in the hall. And he co-curated this. And, so they covered up some of the cases to, create these, temporary walls that he could hang his work on. But then he also did some of those treatments on the cases, and he put his work directly on those cases. What he really wanted to do was put his work inside the cases to kind of just disrupt what was going on in there. But because those, if you're familiar with the way the museum had treated a lot of the material, they would treat them with pesticides that were laced with arsenic, mercury, or lead. So sadly, a lot of the material, the natural material, are poison. And so Chris's work would have been poisoned as well, and it's a huge, just hazmat nightmare to even just open one case. It wouldn't have been possible. But I think this was more effective, putting his work on top of the cases. And so what he did was then he treated the hall as if it were like his antique ledger paper that he draws on. And so he took this antique hall and put his work on top of that. I think, so there's supposed to be a video. I don't know if it'll play. Oh, there we go. That's my daughter.
Brought out of the archives, we heard some voices. There are relatives among the few.
Okay. So you see that screen that's up there in the photo that's on the top left. So that was the screen that played that video, and it runs about 4 minutes, and it looped all day, as well as the music. But that was what you heard when you walked into this hall from 2016, from the fall of 2016 till just recently in January of this year. That music played in there. And what was a dead hall before, so Shannon, when you mentioned Susan Harjo's poem about Museum of the Dead, that's exactly what that hall was until Chris's exhibition was in there. And he deliberately made those choices to bring contemporary music in there, to bring this video. So as a ledger artist, what Chris does is he takes antique ledger paper and he puts something new on it. He creates something new out of it. He repurposes it. So that was the same treatment that he did with the video. He took an old, it was the Thomas Edison video of Native Americans for the Buffalo Bills Wild West show. And it was an exhibition performance. And he took that old image and partnered with a friend of ours, Adam Sings in the Timber, who's Epsaligay or Crow photojournalist who goes to Crow Fair every year. So we had him help edit the video, and he, we wanted him to use some of his photos of contemporary Native people in the video, as well as photos of my daughter, myself. I'm in the video, and Adam's children as well. And especially important to show young Native people, because that's something that's just been so absent in this hall and in the museum. Young Native people just have never or not had a place in the museum. And the music was in collaboration with another friend of ours who's Kushada, and Chamorro, Santiago X is his name, and he created the music. And the music is, it's fresh, new music, and I love it. It's one of my favorite things to hear. And so up in the top right, that photo is Chris's powwow chair, and that is now in the museum's permanent collection. And he created that piece for this exhibition because, he thought, well, if people were collecting today, what would they collect if they were using the same, standards that they were collecting in the past? And he thought, oh, well, I think, what about a powwow chair? Why doesn't the museum have a powwow chair? And one of the really nice things about this image is that when I would bring people in, Native people in, to see Chris's exhibition, they would see this image, and, Native people got it. They would laugh. They would say, yeah, my grandma has one like that, or I remember one, my parents using one when I was a kid, or I still have one, it's all torn up now. So it was an instant, connect for Native people as they were coming into this exhibition hall. And these are just some other treatments, so, of Chris's work next to these older cases that really need to be changed. And so then that's how I got involved, because we were at the museum all the time. My husband, he was a contractor by that time, and we had lots of people coming to visit us in the city, and we thought, hey, let's take you to the Field Museum, let's see Chris's exhibition. And so I was there anyway. And I had left my previous job, so then, I thought, I have time. Let me do this. Let me volunteer. Let me bring Native people into the museum. And so I was volunteering in April 2 years ago, and I volunteered for about 7 months until I got hired on for our renovation project. As the community engagement coordinator. So this is a sign that we have as you enter the hall now, so that people are aware that we're making changes and we're finally doing this, and it's about time that we're doing this. And then here's what the hall is looking like nowadays. So in September or August, actually, of last year, we started the process of deinstallation and deinstalling these cases. And so you could see our conservators there. They're dressed in, and actually the mounters that have to go into the cases have to dress in, like the hazmat suits and, wear the masks and gloves and everything. And so the conservators right now in this photo are testing all the objects for arsenic. And then the photo on the bottom right, that area has been closed off now. And so that's going to be a workspace for conservation and collections teams to continue deinstalling the rest of the cases and have a space to work. So some of the things that we've been doing since then, since I've been there as part of community engagement, is making land acknowledgments. So we have a native garden that's outside of the museum right now, and we did work with community members to help plant the garden. And then we also had this land acknowledgement ceremony because we have a land acknowledgement sign that's in this garden. So I don't know if you saw, the press on that, but it was a huge deal. Our president, made that land acknowledgement, and that's something that, it's something that I was pushing for. The moment I stepped foot into that museum, is to think about Native people and to think about what are the best ways that we can care for and actually serve Native people. This is our advisory committee, so we are not doing this renovation alone. The museum is not doing it alone, because you know what happens if the museum tries to create its own exhibitions about Native people. We need Native people involved, so we have this advisory committee of, we started out with 10 people, but now we have 12 through the suggestion of one of our advisors to add 2 more people. And one is a rotating seat for our local Native community, so we have local Native community members involved in this process. And these are all Native people from around the country and in various professions, in museums, scholars, other curators. And then the museum also made a commitment to hire some Native people to work on this project as well. So we have Native people in conservation, collections, our research, and curatorial departments as well. So we have a total of 7 Native people that are working at the Field Museum right now, which is probably the most the museum has ever had at any one time. So just to kind of give you an example of some of the work that I do, as an artist, I have a vast network of people that I know, and so people reach out to me, and they want to use the Field Museum as a space to create documentaries or do filmmaking or, whatever. And I think, we need to, part of indigenizing is turning the museum into our space, making it a space that we can use however we want. And so here are some filmmakers that are interviewing some Native artists like Frank Wallen and my husband, Chris Pappan, and the photographer, Adam Sings in the Timber. So there's a photo of the community, the planting, and that's my daughter and my husband and a friend of mine. And then my friend Dan Friday. So, I know a lot of artists. So a lot of artists are able to come to the museum. And I really do try to connect people to collections. It's really important for Native people to have that connection with our ancestors and relatives that are down in, the Cultural Resource Center. These are items that, and Shannon mentioned this yesterday, that, these are items that belong to our people and, have gotten to this museum in questionable ways. And so it's really important for us to bring life into collections and to connect with those. And, a lot of those visits, and I don't take photos of those visits because they're very personal and they're very emotional. They can be very happy sometimes, very sad sometimes. And so, but, it's something that's really important for us as Native people to do. And so as far as collecting goes these days, it's not done in those questionable ways anymore. Our curator, Alika Wali, has been collecting contemporary items. So we have a small collection of contemporary powwow, pieces, powwow regalia. And also through my networks, we reached out to Karen Ann Hoffman, who's an Oneida artist, and Kelly Church, who's a Potawatomi Odawa artist, to purchase contemporary pieces from them. And both of these pieces were just acquisitioned this past December. So we're working directly with these artists. We're talking to these artists. We're going to, I think with Karen, we did interview her. So there's an interview, there's a video of her talking about her piece, sitting next to her piece. And, those are important ways that the museum is moving forward. I'm not saying that the museum is perfect. There's still a lot of work to be done. A lot of this is the superficial work that's going on. There's still a lot of work that has to go on internally as well. But I'm trying my best to make the museum a safe space and a welcoming space for Native people when they come, because it can be a hostile place for Native people. And if I can, ease that and make it less hostile, that's the work that I do at the museum. And I think that's it. Yeah. So just thank you.
Thank you all so much. I'm so inspired. And I feel very honored and humbled to be able to learn more about the work that you do. And I do, before we kind of have a conversation, I want it also to be a space where we can ask each other questions. I want to preface it by saying that I thought a lot about this question about how institutions and communities confront and rectify exclusionary practices. And it's not lost on me that as professionals of color, our bodies are actually one of those interventions or disruptions to these mainstream archives and to our profession. And so there's a lot of emotional and invisible labor that comes into that as well. And when we're in mixed company or in predominantly white spaces, we have to think really critically about how we have to measure what we're going to say. And we have been invited to be critical lovers of our institutions, but to get to that place of full honesty can sometimes mean that our jobs can be challenged. But we all have to go back to work on Monday, so we're going to have as open a conversation as possible. But just know that especially for institutions where you only have a couple of people of color working in them, that they're doing this work like constantly. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, our bodies as being these interventions, but also the work that you do. So Rachel, you touched on this ethics of care, and we talked a little bit about our motivations, but I was wondering if maybe you all could get a little more into how you wake up in the morning and go knowingly going into these worlds and environments that can be hostile, and just kind of what motivates you to do this work.
I think I think about my people. I think about Native people. I think that if I'm not there at the Field Museum, who is going to do this work? I know that there are people that are capable. I know that there are non-Native staff members that are caring, but I don't feel that they have the same kind of investment that I have. In this, they could, at the end of the day, go home and cut that part of their life out, whereas I can't. Because Native people, they're always my priority. I'm Native. I go home, I'm with Native people. My family, my husband, and my daughter. And so I can't escape it. It's part of my life. So I'm emotionally invested in this, and that's that's what keeps me going. It keeps me going to ensure that we can make these changes so that Native people don't need to walk into this hostile environment anymore, and that's something that's so important to me.
Yeah, it seems like disengagement isn't really an option for the work that we do.
Okay, so for me, throughout my K-12 education, most of the information and experiences I had in learning about Black history came from outside of the classroom, came from cultural institutions, museums, libraries, in these kinds of places. So for me, there is a responsibility, and I care, I can't escape that. I lead with that. But also being a lover of cultural institutions and knowing the impact that they can have on a young person as a product of that, I feel a responsibility to do what I can to create space and to invite people in and to do what I can so that people can see themselves in ways they may not have seen themselves before. When we're talking about marginalized communities, oppressed histories and people, yes, it's challenging, but knowledge is power, right? And in whatever way I can help people make connections and preserve legacies and understand what people before me have gone through, I consider that a privilege.
I agree, and I'm very moved by the things that the two of you have said. And I think that's a great question that you asked, Amanda. I will start out by saying that, frankly, I did not plan on necessarily being a part of the special collections profession because, as a result of experiences I had in some internships And my general impression of the profession after taking a class or two, I would totally nerd it out on the history of the book. But I said, this profession will probably not be very diverse. Was I ever not wrong? And I had thought I might put my attentions elsewhere. However, because of a great mentor I had, who, when the job came available at Delaware, said, "I hope you apply for that job." And I had already made some contacts at Delaware and other places, and I applied for the job, and I got the job, and it turned out to be a great fit in certain ways because I love doing special collections. I love the history of the book. I love the materiality of the book. But also, I'll say that in terms of the question of how you navigate each day, I mean, it varies from day to day, but it's so important. Implicit in, I think, everything that people have said here are the networks, the supportive networks that you have to sustain you when things do get difficult. And I think that institutions who want to support the diversity work that they may be thinking about or talking about need to understand that you need to, the whole institution needs to support the fostering creation of these networks within and outside of your walls, because it's extremely difficult to be the only one of any first, right, is always going to have, by nature of the society we live in. So I would say I feel fortunate at Delaware. First of all, the Color Conventions Project, I left a lot out of what I said about that project, but it is a community that nurtures and that fosters inclusion in many different ways, including bringing in and recruiting graduate students of color or graduate students who have an interest in this work, paying undergraduate students a good rate for their work and making sure that they get acknowledged. Although I'm going to go back and show the slide where people are named in our project because I was supposed to do that and neglected in the interest of time. But I can't emphasize how important it is to have networks of people and people, like my colleagues here and Rachel. We came out of a program for early career librarians from underrepresented groups. We met 3 years ago, and she's a part of my network now. Through the bonding that happens, you can reach out to people just, as the people in the color conventions did, 150 years ago, to strategize and to think and to plan about how you are going to encounter an obstacle that you may be encountering in your institution. And I also say that I see a change in that I'm seeing more young people of color who are interested in going into special collections and archival work, including the history of the book. And through RBMS, through some of the scholarship programs, I'm seeing our RBMS conferences more diverse. And that, when I go to a conference and I connect with these great people, that also helps to nurture me. So. Thank you so much. Well, this list speaks for itself, but I also want to show the last slide. Oh, somebody said there was a delay, right? So I should wait. Maybe later. A photograph of the group was what I was going to show.
When you brought up, having a support system is something that's really important. And when I was volunteering at the Field Museum, I felt like I was the only Native in the entire institution, and there's over 500 employees, maybe 600 employees, and one Native person. So it's very lonely. It was very lonely. And there were many days where I felt like, I can't do this anymore. I just can't. I can't go in. And, I wanted to cry, and I did cry a handful of times. It was hard, and it's very hard. And, I know I'm not the only Native person. Native people always make up less than less than 0% of any population anywhere. And so, you know, I was really happy when we did hire other Native people, because then, you know, then we had a support system. We had people that I could talk to, that we could talk to each other, and we understood exactly what we were going through. And sometimes that's what you just need. You just need somebody to listen, and you know, understand, and not try to give you any excuses. So, and that's what I do for Native people when they come and visit the museum. And those are my best days, is when Native people come to the museum and we have Indigenous people all over. So, but yeah, it's a love-hate relationship.
Yeah, that net that works, it's so important, and really for survival. And I think about our histories as mestizo people, as mixed people, as Black people, that collectivism being rooted in our survival, we have to rely on each other. And so I kind of wanted, I wanted to open it up, because there's trauma in the work that we do, and then we're constantly being re-traumatized in the work that we do. And and I'm just inspired by seeing how much you have done in these difficult spaces. And I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about, like, working in these spaces. There's this kind of white organizational culture where we are focused on production a lot of times. And when I was working in archives, I should say I'm not working in archives right now, but so much of the work happened outside of the archive, outside of the institution. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that, maybe, and what your experience is with that, because I know sometimes it definitely wasn't prioritized or necessarily even valued in the institution I was at. So what does that look like for you all? Or we can change the question.
Are you talking about like site visits and processing?
Yeah, or relationship building, the communities you work with, and that responsibility you have to them.
So I'll start by saying that more times than I can count, I have, when working with students or even professionals, community members, folks outside of my immediate workspace, they meet me and I get, wow, I've never met a Black archivist before. Like, in the year 2019, that happens an incredible amount of times. So for me, just showing up, like we were talking about our bodies, when I'm in my profession, certainly my Black female body makes a statement. When I'm outside of this environment, I do bring my archivist information professional identity to the table, and that allows for interesting conversations to happen. Speaking with elders about, well, have you ever thought about caring for the photos that are in your basement and like stressing me out right now because they're in compromising conditions, and kind of initiating those conversations, not with an intention for me to have them in my professional capacity, but out of the care for the documents and for the legacy. And so I think just being mindful of identity in different spaces allows for different kinds of conversations, all helpful and instructive in their own way, to happen.
So I feel like, and I think I mentioned this before, I feel like I'm the community member in Chicago, the Native community member that made it into the museum. And I think, you know, one of the best ways to change an institution like the Field Museum is not from the outside in, but from the inside out. And so having me in there and people in the community knowing me, you know, they can easily just call me and say, hey, Debra, I want to come and visit the museum. I have family coming in. Yes, please do. So, I mean, that's a start. It's not, you know, it's simple things like that, little things like that, where I can, you know, I like to say that I kicked the gate open and I'm keeping it open for other Native people to come into the museum. But, I also, whenever I hear of opportunities that are going on in the museum, I always try to make sure, is this something that we can reach out to the Native community about? What are other ways that we can indigenize? We've been reaching out to Native speakers to come into our seminar series lectures, and so we've had Native people come in to lecture, and I always invite Native community members to that. We have a members night event coming up that I'm inviting Native community members to. So I think just having access to the space and actually having a presence in the space is really important. But as far as, for the renovation project, we will be talking and having conversations with Native people in our community. We will be involving youth. Youth will actually have the opportunity to have input on, what they want to see in the renovation, how they might want to see themselves represented, and that's something that's really important. Having that youth voice will show that we're moving forward. We're moving forward with this younger generation. So doing things like that and making sure that I'm representing the Field Museum in the community as well. And I'm always pushing my colleagues to come out to the community and come out to the events. It's one thing to have community always come to the museum. We need to also make a presence out in the community as well. So, and I'm happy to say that my colleagues do actually come out. So now people know who they are. So.
I'd just like to respond to what you just said. Your situation, I know it's challenging in a lot of ways, but I get a sense from talking to you last night of a sense of empowerment in the sense that you are so vitally connected to the community of Native people that it gives you a type of strength and a sort of autonomy that many people don't have working in an academic environment, for example, where maybe you move to a region where you don't, and you're not from that region. And yes, you have networks of people, but it's not the same thing. And this sort of brings up the issue of working within spaces that were not designed or envisioned for bodies such as ours, and I'm including the special collections as a physical space. My colleague Jesse Erickson at the University of Delaware is doing work on the design, the origins of the special collections reading room and how it's based on the model of the gentleman's reading room with the carpeting and the lamps. And people oftentimes in my library don't know that they can enter the Special Collections Gallery because of how it looks, because of how it was designed. It's off-putting and intimidating even to graduate students. So, we have this ironic situation where we're inhabiting spaces, and in some sense inhabiting, there's a fine line between disrupting and being complicit in the practices. So we have to constantly question ourselves and make strategic decisions about how we're going to intervene with our bodies and react to people who enter the space, for example. I, for example, have a practice of really trying to acknowledge as many people who walk into the space as possible, to say hello and recognize that you are there, which runs counter to the introverted, I would say, personality of many of my colleagues and myself as well. But I know what it feels like to enter a space. I remember when I entered a rare book room for the first time, and I would never have gone into a place called a rare book room if I didn't have I was working on a PhD and I needed a particular book. The very title will scare some people away and make it feel like this is not a place where I belong if it's not a part of your background, something you grew up with. So.
That's awesome. Thank you. Do you guys have questions for each other before we open up? Okay. I think we can just open it up to you all now. I'm Amy Armstrong, and I just want to thank you all for sharing your work with us, and also acknowledge for you to have us acknowledge that this is emotional work for everybody, and that you take a risk often sharing your stories. And I think this question is specifically maybe for Debra. When you talked about the work that's being done currently at the Field Museum, and you commented that the work that's being done is sort of kind of superficial at this point, and that there's a lot of work that really needs to be done internally, and a lot of museums and special collections make small gestures, but they really don't have large impact. And I wonder if you would be willing to share a little bit, and I think you have, but a little more of your thoughts of what that might look like, the important work that needs to be taking place at the Field Museum internally. Thank you.
Yeah, and that is one of those questions too that, you know, like, am I in a safe space to really be able to talk about that? So when I say superficially, I mean, representatively. So, you know, the exhibition hall and making sure that we're representing Native people in the right way, in the way that Native people want to be represented. But going deeper, it's, you know, really, it's having that support system, and not just from my close and direct colleagues, but from the entire institution. It has to start from the top down. We need buy-in from everyone to stand behind and support all of their Native staff members in the work that we're doing, and to understand what it is that we're doing. And this is something that I've been talking a lot about lately, is that, you know, my non-Native colleagues, and I think any non-Native people that are working with any sort of Native collection, you know, you need to really immerse yourself with Native people and have conversations with Native people to really understand where we're coming from and how we're feeling about our things being in there. You know, and just really understanding that, you know, we don't want to hear excuses about, you know, why those things are there, why certain things can't be done. You know, that to me is all a priority. You know, anything that's Native related is a priority. And if it's not a priority to my colleagues or to the institution, I can feel it. And that adds to that hostility. And just, you know, anxiety and anguish and all of that. And so I think people need to understand that it's very emotional for Native people that are working there. So how we do that, I don't have an answer.
Yeah, I'm just interested in continuing to think with you about how to make it possible that there wouldn't just be one Black archivist. And I like that phrase, white organizational structures, like just office culture, for example, naming that as what having that be dominantly white looks like in various institutions, academic ones, museums, et cetera. I think I want to think about training, like just what are I'm thinking about the outlier question again, like who's an outlier and who's not, and how some of you, I know Curtis, I talked to you about have a background in as a PhD and then going into library and information studies. Rachel mentioned critical race studies perspectives, so I think some of your training in other places is important. I've worked with library and information studies students here at UT who've often wished there was more room in their program to be able to take cultural studies courses, theory courses, to mix and mingle with other communities. And so I think this is another reason why across these 2 days we have had people who wear multiple professional hats in order to get the work done. I'm not saying that it's better in other academic contexts, but I do know that the strength of Black Studies here at UT is one thing that has made possible the work that Rachel does. You were very clear about that in your presentation, but I know that also from my work on the ground. I'm sitting next to my colleague who's the director of Native American and Indigenous Studies here at UT, Luis Carcamo-Hichante, with whom I've worked in collaboration here at UT to try to open up spaces. And it's work that requires many hands and also these sort of collaborations across spaces that aren't normally talking to each other. So I just would love to hear your thoughts about, what it means to intervene and can you have at your back, other places where maybe there is a better critical mass.
Sure. Well, I can start with my own experience on this campus. I came for the graduate program in information studies here at UT, and during my time there, I was the only Black woman in my cohort, and because of my professional interests, found myself a lot in Black studies. And so my relationships with that department got fostered from going to different symposia and events and me saying, I'm one of y'all, I'm just in a different discipline. So because I wasn't being seen and fed in that way in my home academic department. Now as a professional, and as Curtis mentioned earlier, our profession has been, there's always work to do, but our profession has been making steps and paying attention to this lack of diversity and representation. And so there have been initiatives to help broaden the field and bring people in and help them be successful in this field. So there is talent. There is talent and diverse perspectives ready to enter the field. I think as a profession now, we need to be looking carefully at job descriptions, at expectations, and reckoning with institutional processes that are limiting or might exclude very capable and talented students and professionals of color from being in these spaces. So I don't think it's fair, accurate to say, well, we want to recruit, but we just can't find anyone. Nah, you can't say that anymore. You really can't. I think there's a real responsibility on the institutional side to do some internal reckoning and changing it to make your institution a place where people of color can come and be successful.
I agree, and this is a work, as we all know, of disruption, and this ultimately this is a question. I think that the spaces that we work in, the library, the archival, special collections profession, is a microcosm of our society. So we are living at a time when the right of people of color to be here is contested. So it's going to manifest itself everywhere. And it's long-standing practices, and now a moment when we are threatened and challenged. So I would say, just having said that in passing, that with the change that I see happening in the profession and that Rachel is talking about, the initiatives, scholarships, Rare Book School, IMLS scholarship, a fellowship of a couple of years ago that brought a lot of people into RBMS, into Rare Book School. They're well-intentioned and they're far too little. They're very modest. Even the most committed programs of ARL, Mark Puente, the ARL diversity programs, the statistics for librarianship, librarians of color, be they Asian, Native American, African American, Latino, are about where they were when these programs started, 15 or 20 years ago. And it's such a complicated and interlocking set of obstacles that are partly financial, partly cultural, the culture of whiteness that April Hathcock has written about, the types of practices that Rachel is talking about. People may enter the field and then they may leave a few years later because of what it's like to be the only one. For example, with the microaggressions and the sort of tax where, somebody asks you to be on a committee or to do work that's important. And it's important, but you may end up saying yes to more things than you comfortably can because you feel it's important to try to do the work. So it's a very complicated and multi-generational and societal task ultimately to really make a change. But I will say that for those people who are in management, the management level is a key factor in making organizational change, because these are the people who have the power to affect the climate where they are, and to step out and support individuals of color who now may be trolled on social media because you're sitting on a panel talking about dismantling white supremacy, which happened, right? And if the high administrator at a library, for example, knows that somebody is being trolled, which happened at Simmons, and this administrator stepped out and said, "Don't attack this person who works here at our library. Come after me," to step out to help protect this person. All levels, like has already been said, need to have buy-in, and this is going to be disruptive, and many people are not going to be happy with these changes. But I think they're necessary if this profession is going to reflect the society we live in.
And to writing on that and then taking it back to you, yes, the solution is to hire more Native people in these kinds of institutions, to hire more people of color, because that is something that's a problem behind the scenes. You see all the people of color out on the front end. They're selling tickets, they're selling the food in the cafes, they're cleaning bathrooms, they're security guards, but we need more people of color behind the scenes. We need more people in those administrative positions, and I think that is where a lot of that support would come from too, and that understanding.
I have to admit that I was struck by you pointing out the insensitive use of the term costume. And it made me start thinking about how many of our institutions rely on the Library of Congress cataloging system, which is where that term comes from, as the generic, and wondering how the word that came to my mind was how to decolonize the cataloging system, and where that responsibility really lies.
I don't know. I think, and maybe Shannon would be in a better position to answer this later, and from a legal standpoint, I don't know. I mean, that's something, I didn't know that about the Library of Congress and the term being used there. So I honestly, I don't know. But I think, listening to what Native people and their concerns is something that's really important. Maybe there needs to be a revisit and consultation and collaboration with Native people. Maybe I don't know if Native people are aware of that. Because we're making that change out here when we hear it. We're making that change when we walk into the Field Museum, and we're just shocked when we see that. And it's something that we talk about in conversation. It's something that's on social media. It's something that's in people's blogs. But yeah, I know that we're making that change out here, and trying to help people understand that that's not a proper term. There's a lot of terms that are not proper to use anymore that people still use, and I don't think costumes is the only word that we need to worry about in. So maybe there's some sort of revisit that we all need to do there.
To respond to that question also in a different way, as an archivist who encounters legacy description, some of it problematic, some of it there's erasure and no description, which can be almost just as harmful. I acknowledge that there's work to do there, and I'm not always convinced that going up and cleaning up is my job. So for me, the photo collection that I used as an example, that's one. It's fully described. I can't tell you who did it or what their practices or ideas were. But because I don't have the bandwidth to go back and clean up and add, I choose instruction as a way for me to think about things differently and to share that thought process with others, whether it be students or colleagues. So that's one way kind of around that labor of who's actually going back and doing the work. That should be a shared task. As the one black person or the one person who might identify it, I don't know that it's my responsibility to go back and clean and change everything when I'm just but one person among several.
It's a really important question, the question of nomenclature and cataloging. And I am not a cataloger. However, there's been a history of people working to change how items are described, most notably in the people that I sort of look back to, Dorothy Porter Wesley at the Moreland Springer collection at Howard University, who developed a system for the use at Howard. But I'll say, with the problems that still remain, there is some work going on in classroom instruction and classroom projects, in the digital projects that are being developed, where students get a chance to work with materials, recently digitized collections, and working with instructors and librarians and archivists who are aware of the kind of issues of erasure and problematic nomenclature. And I've worked with some classes where the creating metadata for digitized collections is where they're able to learn about these issues and how to render people visible who may be rendered invisible in the photograph or not identified in the photograph you were talking about. So.
Yes, hi, my name is Astrid Drongeldeer, and first I want to thank you all for the inspiring work that you've talked about today. My question is for Debra, and I wanted to say that I was surprised and pleased to hear that the Field Museum has changed its acquisition policy to include artworks by contemporary indigenous artists. And I say surprised by that because it's the Field Museum, the full name of which is Field Museum of Natural History. And my question to you and for your advisory committee is whether you have had this conversation as a way, of disrupting, or as Curtis was saying, of inhabiting spaces. Have you had this discussion about addressing in the renovation of the hall the history of museums that has categorized indigenous people in natural history as opposed to other types of museums? So, in other words, addressing the white organizational structure that put them there in the first place.
Yeah, we talk about that all the time, and that's definitely something that the advisory committee brought up at pretty much the very first meeting that we had, and yeah, I think we will. So the project was greenlit last year in January, and that's when they hired me on in my role. And our advisory committee was formed and then met for the first time last March of last year. And since then, we've been in kind of just development mode, brainstorming. And that's definitely something that comes up. We want to talk about the history of the Field Museum and their treatment of Native peoples in the very beginning, and the way that they were collecting, and that the impact that has had on Native people. We don't want to focus on it too much, though, because we do want to focus on people today and how we are today and where we're at today. But we definitely want to confront that and we have to put it out there, because once we have the museum admit that and put that out in public, I think that would help us toward healing. So yes, we will, and we still question, like why are Native people in a natural history museum? And and we want the public to ask that too, because I don't know if they do. It's because at one time we were savages, we were animals, just like the other animals that are in the museum. And really interesting, I was on the elevator one day, and there was a woman that got on the elevator, and she was an Asian woman, and I think she was visiting the country, and she was looking up at the so on the elevator, we have the different floors and, the features on each of those floors. And she saw, I think it was the Native American, on the main level of the museum. And she looked up at the photo and she told her friend that she was with, she said, "People, you have people in here? This is a natural history museum." And her friend was like, "Well, aren't we all a part of the natural world?" And she was just like, she just really did not understand why. So she got it, and I wanted to yell. I wanted to be like, "Yeah!" on there. But yeah. I mean, one day maybe we'll be like, we'll have our own museum and have everything. But, that's a dream.
Thank you, everybody, so much. If we could thank our panelists. I think we're at time now.